Don't be a dummy. Listen to Bebo. Don't be a dummy. Bebo's Gwent for Dummies.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Gwent for Dummies. This time, we're going to be focusing on the infamous question, which faction should I play? Now, there are 6 factions currently in Gwent, and these are Monsters, Nilfgaard, Scoia'tael, Scoia'tael, Northern Realms, and the Syndicate as well, the Syndicate. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about each faction's general playstyle, main identity, and potential archetypes within. I also have a super special guest, the Fox Bride, Mr. Whispers of Oxenfurt creator himself, who's going to be telling you a little bit about the lore behind each faction. But before we get started, I mentioned something called archetypes. And for those of you who are new to card games, I'm going to explain exactly what an archetype is. So, archetypes are specific strategies that you can build your deck around. These are cards that are made to synergize with each other, and your deck is usually going to consist of 1 or 2 of these archetypes, and each faction actually has different archetypes within them. As we go over each faction, I'll give some examples of archetypes that can be found in each one. Keep in mind, there may be more archetypes than what I list because this is meant to be a general explanation, and also future expansions can and will add more options. So, without further ado, who actually says that anyways, let's dive right into our first faction, and we're gonna start with Monsters. Monsters, or MO for short, includes everything from monstrous bugs through less or more intelligent vampires all the way to the big bad Witcher baddies, the Wild Hunt. This is a faction that generally likes to focus on their own side of the board. What this means is they tend to put out units that are either high value right away, or will generate a lot of value without interacting with the opponent's side of the board at all. This is of course a very general way to look at the faction, and there are actually archetypes within Monsters that pay a lot of attention to making your opponents bleed, such as vampires, which you will then benefit from. Monsters is a very beginner-friendly faction, and a good one to start with if you want to simply focus on learning how the game works without worrying too much about what your opponent might be doing. If you've ever played Magic the Gathering, Monsters is essentially green, in that you tend to focus on smorky smorky, stompy stompy. Monster archetypes include Thrive. Thrive is actually a specific mechanic that's mostly played alongside high-powered units. If you have a unit on the board with Thrive, every time you play a unit which has higher power than the unit with Thrive, the Thrive unit will boost itself by 1. This effect is ongoing as long as the unit stays on the board. Big Boys and Point and Slam. This is exactly what it sounds like. You throw in as many high-value cards into your deck as possible, and throw them onto the board and smorky smorky, stompy stompy, your opponent into oblivion. DEATHWISH. DEATHWISH is one of my favorites, and these are units that have an effect when they are killed. They can be killed by either you or your opponent. Most of the time this effect is going to be beneficial for you. Pair these units with another archetype, Consume, and you have yourself some pretty awesome synergies. Consume. Consume is also what it sounds like. You consume things. There are a couple consume cards that will eat your opponent's units, but most of the time you're focusing on your own side of the board, and usually trying to consume DEATHWISH units. DEATHWISH and consume almost always go together, but I felt the need to separate them as archetypes to make it easier to understand. Vampires. Vampires are all about, well, blood of course, bleeding. Vampires will benefit while your opponent's units slowly die. There's even a card called Crimson Curse that makes your board super awesome looking, but we don't really talk about that card. But at least it's pretty to look at. Now, if those mechanics don't entice you enough, here is some lore behind the Monsters faction to convince you to join the Smork side.
Monsters, also in the vein of not being too lore-friendly, range from the most disgusting foul creatures to spectral warriors. The Wild Hunt are NL elves who inhabit a completely different world from the elves of the continent. The king of the Wild Hunt leads a spectral army to ride the skies at night, kidnapping and abducting humans to become their slaves. Some have escaped and told the tales of toiling day and night, but due to traveling between worlds, they did not age, and when they returned home, everyone they knew had passed. They travel in their ship known as the Naglfar, in which their arrival in Skellige will signal the end of times, at least in Skelligan tradition. Ciri eventually traveled between worlds, where she comes into contact with an NL elf known as Avalok. Here she became a de facto prisoner to Eredin and Avalok, as they both wanted her to breed with their then king Oberon. Why, you ask? Because Ciri was a descendant of Laradoran, an elf, and carries the Elder Blood gene. Long story short, he finds all humans disgusting, they don't mate, and Ciri has to escape with the help of unicorns, specifically her old friend, the Huraquax. The blood-sucking vampires make up a large contingent of monsters, with your lower vampires, Fletters, Plumards, and Garcanes. The more intelligent and sophisticated kind being Alps, Catacans, Nekarats, Bruxa, and most of all, the higher vampires. Your holy water, garlic, and stakes through the heart will do nothing to them, as showcased by Regis, once being decapitated, dismembered, stake in his heart, and buried, only to slowly regenerate over the next 50 years.
While monsters might love to focus on their side of the board, growing, thriving, and having huge beasts come to play, the next faction we're going to talk about is almost the opposite. This is the Empire of Nilfgaard, also known as NG. A huge, power-hungry empire that just keeps invading things, practicing slavery, spying, and plotting. True to the lore, Nilfgaard is on a quest to dominate their opponent, be it through locking their units or even stealing them. Nilfgaard is definitely a control-heavy faction that can really screw with your opponent's game plan. This is the faction to play if you simply enjoy watching the world burn, and getting no GGs. Here are some archetypes you'll find in Nilfgaard. Control. This is arguably more a style of play than an archetype, but I feel it needs to be mentioned here. When someone says control, they're talking about a deck that has a lot of cards that lock your opponent's cards and render their effects useless, and you'll usually have a lot of spell cards that just simply kill things. There's more to control than this, but in general, you pretty much just fuck everything your opponent wants to do because you're an asshole. Spies. Spies are units that will be played on your opponent's side of the board, but then usually benefiting you enough so it ends up being worth giving your opponents a few points here and there. There aren't many full-out spy decks as of right now, but they can definitely help you and be fun to mix into other archetypes. Assimilate. Assimilate is my personal favorite style of deck offered within the Nilfgaard faction. This is the OMG RNG, why I so good at game OMG deck. You create things out of thin air that can either be exactly what you want or maybe not. You also have units that have the Assimilate tag. Units with this tag will boost themselves by 1 every time you play a card that wasn't originally in your deck, pretty much rewarding you for creating random shit. And no kappa, this is a good deck for learning the cards in the game, as you'll be playing different ones every game. Mill. I'm not gonna talk about Mill. Soldiers. Soldiers are simply a tag that some cards have. Nilfgaard has a lot of soldiers. They're an empire after all. If you like military and empire type stuff, you'll love playing these dudes. Oh, and Nilfgaard has this guy. Looks like a certain guy, I know. But, Anyways, it's lore time. Enjoy.
Nilfgaard. The name strikes terror in the hearts of its enemies. Following the defeat at the Battle of Brenna in the Second Northern War, the Peace of Sintra established the Empire's northern border at the edges of the Yaruga, still within striking distance of the prosperous northern realms. The early human settlers of the area mixed with the type of unsayed elves, eventually incorporating the Elven language into their culture. Here, they slowly built up their possessions in the centuries leading up to the Northern Wars. But it is said within the Empire that the only true Nilfgaardians reside in the titular capital itself. The Empire of the Great Sun has been able to conquer largely through its legendary army. At the head sits the despotic imperator himself, Emperor Emir var Emreis, the white flame dancing on the barrows of his enemies. Protecting him at all times is his personal guard, the fanatical Impera Brigade. At his service is the Field Marshal, the most famous being Menno Koorn, who met his demise in the rushing waters of the Chotla River at Brenna, a ragged band of dwarves making sure of that. The lifeblood of the military has always been its infantry, the Ardfane Division, led by Ramon Tyrcannel, the Alba Armor Division, led by Tibor Egebrocht, a man whose loyalty was never in doubt, the Dythven, Magne, and Venendal divisions all being notable, but none as infamous as the dreaded Nausicaa Brigade, the Death's Heads. If you care to know why they are called that, just ask them. Of course, conquering nations are made much easier by sowing dissent behind enemy lines. Vattier del Redu, head of Nilfgaardian military intelligence, has his spies and infiltrators in every realm known to man. But even master spies are not immune to the deceit of others. A famous bard was known to say, "The armies of Nilfgaard leave behind them nothing but desolation and corpses, entire fields of corpses. It's a war of total extermination, Nilfgaard against everything." But I say the Empire brings civilization to the savages, prosperity to the poor, and order to chaos.
Next up, we have Northern Realms, aka NR. Northern Realms is a faction that tends to favor units which take advantage of the order mechanic. Units with order can use abilities such as boosting itself or others or damaging your opponent's units. Some of these units even have charges, which you can refill to bombard your enemy. NR focuses a lot around engines, and a couple of the best decks in NR are actually just an overload of these little assholes. Seriously, they just keep coming out. Some archetypes in NR include Self-Boost. Self-Boost is exactly what it sounds like. You play things, they boost things, boosted things do things, and everyone is happy and boosted. When you're playing a boost deck, you aren't extremely worried about what your opponent is doing, rather focusing on your side of things and making big boosty boys. Control. Northern Realms has a lot of options for control. Control with this faction is all about getting a bunch of engines in the form of machines and soldiers onto the board and giving them charges. These little dudes will ping everything your opponent tries to play. It's really, really annoying. Don't play it. Okay, just kidding. You can play it. But don't play it. Engines and machines. I sort of already mentioned these, but it's such a huge part of NR that I feel I should say it again. NR has a bunch of these types of cards, and it can simply overwhelm your opponent if your opponent doesn't have the right cards to remove them. Warfare. There's also a mechanic in NR called Warfare. It does... what does it do again? Oh, stuff. I don't know, actually, no one really plays Warfare. Maybe you can be the first person to make a tier 1 Warfare deck. Challenge, do it, I dare you. That about sums up NR. It's really just a bunch of machines and ping boys going crazy, and that's about it. If you want to party with the boys, this is the faction for you. Now, once again, here is some lore behind the Northern Realms.
The great kingdoms of the Northern Realms, so prone to fighting amongst themselves, now have a perpetual enemy to the south. The kingdom of Cintra, led by the Lioness of Cintra, Queen Calantha, was invaded by the Nilfgaardians and the city sacked. In what is known as the Slaughter of Cintra, many women killed their children, the women in turn killed by the men, then the men committing suicide. This was in response to the notion that Nilfgaard takes no prisoners. Knowing this, Calanthe threw herself from the walls of her castle, instantly dying on the cobblestones below. The war culminated in the Battle of Sodden Hill, where among the participants included Triss Marigold, Philippa Eilhart, Sabrina Glevissig, Yennefer of Vengerberg, and Donimir of Troy. This catastrophic loss for Nilfgaard ended their invasion, but they did not wait long to return. When the Black Ones invaded again, it was through Lyria, led by Queen Meve, which quickly fell, but the Queen, along with her right-hand man, escaped to fight on. She would go on to come into contact with a white-haired witcher, knighting him for his help in the battle for the bridge on the Yaruga. If only her son would be a bit more heroic. But it all culminates in the decisive Battle of Brenna. Every major kingdom participated, including Redania, Temeria, Aedirn, and Kedwin, who sent in the famed Dunbanner light cavalry. The commander of all forces was Constable John Natalis, who bested his counterpart and won the day. But perhaps the greatest hero of all took no lives, but along with her fellow doctors and healers, saved dozens. The Witcher saga can be traced back to Princess Pavetta's 15th birthday, where a gaggle of men vied for her hand. Windhelm of Atra, Kudkudak, and Visegard were among those who witnessed her outburst as her cursed lover Duny was attacked. Geralt of Rivia defended him. The curse was broken, and the law of surprise took over, the Witcher's reward being that which they had but did not know yet.
Scoia'tael. Scoia'tael, or ST for short, is the next faction we're going to talk about. Scoia'tael is a bunch of rejects. Okay, just kidding. But it is a bunch of dwarfs, elves, and dryads for the most part, non-humans, freedom fighters, lots of bow and arrows, sort of a nature, ancient knowledge theme going on. Scoia'tael has quite a few options for playstyles, and a couple pretty unique ones, such as ambush and handbuff. Let's dive right into some of the archetypes that you'll find within the Scoia'tael faction. Dwarves. Dwarves is actually just a tag, or type of card in which there is a dwarf. Dwarves have a lot of cards that synergize when played alongside other dwarves. They like to keep each other company. Elves. Elves are the same as dwarves in that it's simply a tag for a type of card, and just like dwarves, they synergize very well with each other. Dwarfs and elves can probably be put into the same category a lot of the time, which would be Swarm. Swarm is again exactly what it sounds like. You chuck things onto the board, and those things chuck other things, and other things appear. You then play cards that boost all of the things you chucked onto the board, and this is Swarm in the simplest terms, and Scoia'tael is full of it. Movement. A lot of cards in Gwent rely on being in a specific row for them to work, and movement can deny value from these cards. Movement is sort of a trickier style of deck to play, because you need to know exactly what your opponent's going to play, and what you're going to need to move to mess with them and deny value. You can also move your own units, as there are cards that synergize simply from things moving. This deck isn't too common, but it can be a lot of fun when it works. Harmony. Harmony is a mechanic that only Scoia'tael has, and it's a little tricky to explain, but pretty much if you play a card with Harmony, every card played after that, which has a different tag on the board, will boost the Harmony card by 1. This mechanic takes a bit to get used to, but it is something you can mix and match into almost every style of Scoia'tael deck you can build. So that's Scoia'tael in a nutshell. If you like dwarfs and elves and fantasy stuff, this is the faction for you. Oh yeah, and there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of naked green ladies. So, if you like naked green ladies, this is the faction for you. Lore time. Go!
The Scoia'tael are probably the least lore-friendly faction in Gwent. A better name for them would probably be the Elder Races, or humans/non-monsters, as dwarves, gnomes, dryads, and elves make up the majority of their ranks. The unsayed elves of the continent are different than the NL, which inhabit another world. The continental elves arrived in their white ships and settled the lands now known as the Northern Realms. Once the humans arrived, the elves tried to make peace and share the land, but treaty after treaty was broken, eventually leading to pogroms and massacres of non-humans. After being pushed back into the lands of Dol Blathana in modern-day Kedwin, they made a last stand led by the White Rose of Scheherazade, Ailerin. She led the elven youth into the fire, into glory, and into death. The continued discrimination finally led to the formation of the Scoia'tael, armed bands bent on retribution against humans. A common nickname being squirrels, as that is what Scoia'tael means in Elvish, as well as them attaching squirrel tails to their clothing. Having a common enemy in the Northern Realms, they would ally with the Nilfgaardian Empire and help in their invasion. In return, they would be granted full autonomy over Dol Blathanna, with Enid an Glenna, Francesca Findabair, as its queen. The most notable and infamous of the Scoia'tael being the Vryhed Brigade, led by the Iron Wolf, Isengrim Fol Tiarna. They would participate in the fatal Battle of Brenna, and after the Peace of Cintra, would be declared outlaws, with the commando leaders being sentenced to death. Isengrim escaped and made an unlikely alliance with another outlaw as they traveled into the unknown. In a bit of irony, some of the cards here are openly antagonistic against the Scoia'tael. Pauli Dahlberg, for instance, was killed in a Scoia'tael attack on a convoy he was helping escort. The dwarven lands of Mahakam, led by Bruverhug, despised the Scoia'tael, and even sent a volunteer army led by Barclay Els to fight them and their Nilfgaardian allies at Brenna. Other dwarves who fought that day were Zoltan Chevet, Figgis Merlutso, Munro Broys, Yarpen Zigrin, Dennis Cranmer, and Sheldon Skaggs.
Skellige. Skellige, or SK for short, are the Islanders. These are the love children of Vikings and Celts, sprinkled with shape-shifting bear boys and creepy cults. These dudes love to get rowdy, they love a good fight, and that is reflected in their playstyle. This faction is all about berserk damage, even if it means hurting themselves. As such, they have cards to work well with damaged allies and enemy units alike. These guys can even bring cards back from the dead. Let's get into some of the archetypes you'll see in Skellige. Berserk, or self-harm, is a mechanic that gives benefits if a unit reaches a certain level of damage. Most of the time, you'll be planning on dealing this damage to yourself to get the effect of the cards. Berserk can be tricky to use, but when played properly can really add up in value. Discard. Admittedly, Discard has seen better days and isn't played very much right now, if at all, but this is something worth mentioning as it's always been a part of Skellige. Discard cards allow you to throw cards into your graveyard in order to draw different, hopefully more useful, cards. There are units that synergize with Discard as well, and hopefully in the future we'll see more of these, as I have always loved this archetype personally. Bloodthirst. Bloodthirst are units that rely on your opponent being beat up. These cards have effects that trigger if a certain number of enemy units are damaged. True to the lore, you just want to beat some shit up. Damage and boost. This is more of a general playstyle, but it's a huge part of Skellige as a faction, and there are even a few units that trigger effects, such as boosting themselves, when you deal damage to your opponent. Skellige is all about hurting the enemy, hurting yourself, reviving your stuff, and doing it all over again. It's a very good faction to play if you're having a tough day and need to take it out on something. Now, some lore behind these rowdy island folk.
Ah, the smell of salt in the air. We must be in the rocky, inhospitable to anyone normal, Isles of Skellige, a collection of skilled sailors headed by clans who elect among them a king, most notable of them being Ice Twersek, king of Skellige and Cintra, due to his marriage to the queen, creating a strong alliance. But it was not to last. The Black Ones, ever thirsting for blood, attacked Cintra and killed Ice. Not once to sit back and grieve, the islanders unleashed the fury of the seas. Led again by Bran Twersek and his nephew Crack on Crate, wave after wave of raiding parties attacked and pillaged the Nilfgaardian shores. Every clan from Twersek, On Crate, Haymay, Daimon, Brokvar, and Drummond joined in tasting revenge for their fallen comrades. That, or they just like killing. But the Isles aren't all fun and games. An ancient deity, thought to be long forgotten, still has its followers. Svalblood priests and cultists lead the macabre and violent rituals that make even the most hardened veteran of battle turn their head away in disgust. The druid Artis, the leader of the Vidcarls, stop at nothing in order to please his god. According to Skellige belief, The end of the world will be precipitated in the final battle of good and evil, called Ragnar Rogue. The mystical spectral army will arrive, and the golden rooster Camby must awaken the fierce warrior Heimdall to answer the call of battle. If you find yourself having to traverse the Great Sea, I would steer clear of the isles, lest a wild boar arrive and rear its fangs.
The Syndicate. The Syndicate, SY for short, is the newest faction to enter the world of Gwent. In fact, this faction was created by CDPR and therefore has no real big lore behind it, so we'll just be talking about its general playstyle and what it's all about. This faction revolves around the free city of Novigrad and its different gangs. These dudes are the medieval fantasy equivalent of the Mafia. They're all about the money, or coin. In fact, coins are a special mechanic unique to the Syndicate faction. Coins are gained by certain units or leaders and then spent by units later for different effects and rewards. Let's talk about some of the archetypes within the Syndicate. Control. We've talked about this before. The only thing that makes the Syndicate control decks different from the other control decks is that you're spending coins to do damage most of the time. These coin generators/spenders act as your engines to dominate with. Swarm. We've also talked about Swarm before, but Syndicate has quite a bit of Swarm cards that can overwhelm the board if you have the coins for it. Intimidate. Intimidate is a specific mechanic that some units will have, which means every time you play a crime card, they're going to damage a random enemy unit by 1. These crime cards are Syndicate exclusive special and spell cards that can either damage your opponent, boost yourself, gain coins, or a mix and match of any of those. The Syndicate is definitely not a beginner faction, so I won't go into too much detail here about all of its intricacies. I'm sure you can find a video explaining this faction in more detail if you so choose. This is the faction for you if you really like to do math. And that about sums up the general ideas and lore behind each faction in Gwent. I hope this helps you get an idea about what each faction is all about. I do want to quickly mention that there is a reason I haven't really talked about how good or meta each faction or archetype may or may not be. I'm a huge believer in playing something that you're personally drawn to and will find fun, rather than just jumping into the most popular and biggest net deck on day one. Especially if you're a new player, it's much more important to simply enjoy yourself and learn the actual basics of the game in the beginning. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video, and have fun with your new favorite faction. Sayonara, do svidaniya, na razie. See you next time.
Don't be a dummy. Listen to Bebo. Don't be a dummy. Bebo's Gwent for Dummies.